What's up, everyone? It's Dakota, and welcome back to another episode of the Why Nobody Plays series, a series where we look at a card that is either a single or multi-format all-star that has then since been relegated to the fringes of said formats or obscured, where it really doesn't see much play anymore. You know, you might see it pop up from time to time. Maybe it is good when it shows up, but ultimately it's just not a core part of the format anymore. And we probably have one of the newest cards in our total list of all the cards that we have done so far in the series as a whole. And I think it's very surprising because I think probably even just a year or two ago, maybe not a year ago, maybe like 2 years ago, you know, we would have seen, I think you would have been crazy if you said that this card wouldn't have been playable, you know, in 2024, and we really haven't seen too much of it, honestly, even though part of the time it'd probably be pretty. But, you know, with all that said, we're going to be looking at Wrenn 6, our very first card from a Modern Horizon set, which is pretty crazy because, as you know, these Modern Horizon sets are pretty juiced, and like the stuff that does kind of get to, that isn't on the super broken side, but is still really, really good, you know, ends up being kind of these format staples and stuff for quite a while, honestly. And I think Wrenn 6 has kind of become the first Modern Horizons card that I think it might be the best card in Modern Horizons. You know, that's actually legal in the format. You know, we could argue Urza, which is probably another card that could end up on. You know, Yawgmoth has seen a lot of competitive viability in 2024, but really Wrenn 6 is the card that a lot of people think about. You know, this is a multi-format all-star, or at least it was, till it was banned in Legacy, and that's got to tell you something where, you know, this is a card that is banned in Legacy, you know, but is legal in Modern and says essentially no Modern play, and again has been, you know, a part of a few different archetypes in the Modern format. You know, it's been in Verdex, it's been a part of like unfair strategies, and probably not necessarily one of the most toxic, but definitely what we call 4-color money pile. Pretty sweet deck, you know, if you just, you know, had like a trust fund and your parents do access it. But before we get into Wrenn 6 and we talk about its competitive pedigree and ultimately why it's not really a card that anybody sees anymore in the Modern format or in competitive formats in general, kind of spoiled Legacy a little bit there. But if you're interested in videos like this or us covering the competitive formats of the Standard, Modern, and Pioneer format, I would implore you that you please subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell so you know when videos get posted. It's a very easy way to support me and my content, and if you go down in the description below, I have a few links, one to my Discord server, you can feel free there. Check out the Casual Spikes podcast where me and Randy over Modern with Randy, we go over the competitive format at the time, usually RCQ season. Right now it's Standard, and we're actually going to be trying to experiment with some gameplay on the channel as well, so if you're interested in watching some classic Standard matchups, Modern or Pioneer matchups on that, you can go and subscribe over there as well. Finally, I would like to thank the channel Manatraders. If you use my code in the description down below, you will participate in their free tournament series, which doesn't really pick back up until January, but you can qualify for the invitational. They're giving out a lot in prizes there, and again, it's free, and of course being able to rent and play whatever decks that you have. But with all that said, let's go ahead and kind of break down Wrenn 6 and kind of explain why I think this card is very powerful, and I mean, ultimately it was very powerful and one of the premier planeswalkers of the Modern format for a time. So here it is, folks. We have Wrenn 6, a 2-cost planeswalker, a red and a green for 3 loyalty that ends up having 3 abilities. So +1, you return up to 1 target land card from your graveyard to your hand. -1, Wrenn 6 deals 1 damage to any target. -7, you get an emblem with instant and sorcery cards in your game have reach. I'll kind of touch on this last ability here real quick before I kind of explain the overall like cost and everything of the card, and we got ability. But retrace essentially means that you cast an instant or sorcery, in this case from your graveyard, by paying its cost and discarding a land. So essentially you have to have an additional cost of discarding a land to be able to cast a spell, and it doesn't get exiled from your graveyard. You're able to recast it over again, so it's kind of something similar Underworld Breach card where you have to like exile 3 cards in addition to paying cards cost, but then once it resolves, back to your, so unless obviously something else would happen to it, your opponent is able to exile it. So just something to keep in mind when thinking about cards. So Wrenn 6, 2 mana, 3 loyalty. 3 loyalty is absolutely huge when we're talking in the context of, you know, Modern and Legacy and things. Up until I think Modern Horizons 2, where we got Unholy Heat, you know, I think even Lightning Bolt was still kind of like the go-to answer kind of for planeswalkers, and the fact that Wrenn 6, you know, compared to something like Jace, which historically has been like play this. It's a 3 loyalty planeswalker, and you kind of have a decision to make where, do I plus my Jace to get it out of bolt range, or do I just kind of brainstorm with it, kind of, get the card advantage going and kind of get my value out of it and let me play with it well. All right, Wrenn 6 is in the very enviable position of a lot of time being a 2-mana planeswalker that is going to have 4 loyalty on it and allow you to buy back a land. So it just, end up being at 4 loyalty. Again, doesn't die to lightning bolt, of course. So then actually when we printing of Unholy Heat, there's a very good chance that later, like Wrenn 6 was going to die even after a few activations, which in a lot of cases really didn't end up mattering, but just something to kind of keep in mind into the context of right? There really wasn't like a super good way to get rid of a Wrenn 6 on the battlefield up until it came around. Just had red board or something like that, which really didn't see a whole lot of play until Scam ended. But just something that came to mind, we have a 2-mana planeswalker that ends up having 4 loyalty, which is a lot in like when we consider like the context of the time where we had Hogak was definitely the best deck, and for almost 2 months was like the very best thing to doing. Even the last like Pro Tour level event that Hogak was legal for, essentially the builds of Hogak that we're used to seeing, and then we had the decks that were lost percentage points against a lot of the field, but was very good against the mirror, and then you had everybody else, and this is one of the times where everybody else actually won, but this was definitely a huge tournament. So, Wrenn 6 not really getting a lot of love early on. Again, it was a 2-mana planeswalker that just didn't have any real ability stood out except for that emblem of, which, I think as a casual player, you could be like, yeah, I want to play this because it does something very flashy, and Wrenn 6's thing really isn't flashy, even though it is actually pretty good, and then all of its other plus and minus abilities don't really do it much justice to protect itself, in the late game. It's another planeswalker that is probably going to give you some incremental advantage if you draw in the late game, and it's obviously insane in the early game, especially when you're so just again something else to keep. But as we kind of see, Wrenn 6, or excuse me, the Hogak kind of fall off, ended up getting banned out of the format, and Faithless Looting as well in that same ban. So is it Phoenix, the second best deck in the format, kind of getting to kick the can down the road here and then end up ruining our Sacred Pioneer format later. But kind of after that, Wrenn 6 had kind of seen a few different shapes in that as it kind of took on different roles. So to go through some of the abilities here and going into the decks to kind of showcase those abilities. So +1, return up to 1 target land card from your graveyard to your hand. At the time, the most popular way of doing this, the cycling lands ended up getting reprinted, where you could pay 1 of a respective color, like Tranquil Thicket. You could pay a green mana, cycle it to draw a card. This was something that a lot of players took too early on, and of course we got Nurturing Peatland, things like that. So it was like lands that could end up drawing cards later on, where you could just pick these up and kind of get your value, and then later see more Triomes get printed, so you just end up having cycling them early, being able to pick them up with Wrenn 6, and kind of do the same thing, except you'd have a little bit more mana fixing, and of course they were fetchable as well, so if you didn't need them for mana, you could just kind of keep them in your deck. Or if you found them and you had a Wrenn 6, you can kind of just pay 3 mana to draw a card every turn, which really wasn't that bad. How grindy kind of went. Of course, then later on, we ended up getting again more Triomes, so you had better mana to use your fetch lands and stuff. Fetch lands being the most popular thing to return back, because nowadays, you get card selection with the Surveil lands, you end up getting the mana fixing from the Triomes, you end up you still have shock lands, so you're able to go shock lands, and of course in Legacy, when it was legal, you just ended up getting to fetch untapped dual lands. Obviously with the only consequence being that if you're upon a wasteland, you're sad, but nonetheless, Wrenn 6 just ensuring that you're going to hit your 3rd land drop, and then from there just continue to do so. In something like Standard or even Pioneer, this wouldn't necessarily be very powerful, because there's not very many fetch lands that you want to play in the format, especially none that really get any of the dual lands that you care about, or even some tri-colored lands. But when you have things like Bloodstained Mire, things like that, that you're able to kind of buy back from your graveyard, continue to hit your land drops, continue to make sure that you have essentially perfect mana, where you're going to cast all of your spells of varying different colors at any point in time and in any combination. This ended up just being a very powerful +1 ability for a lot of decks that really just wanted that kind of mana where they wanted to make sure that we're drawing a card every turn. And of course, you know, fetch lands just incrementally making your draw steps even better. And as we have printed better land, this +1 has technically gotten better over time, especially again when you fetch lands a thing and, you know, getting to fetch surveil lands. So pretty neat there. -1, Wrenn 6 deals 1 damage to any target. So this is kind of a weak ability, I would say, on its face. I mean, -1, you end up dealing 1 damage to any target. Like, sure, you could hit your opponent with it, you know, to maybe trigger some sort of life loss ability or whatever the case. But a lot of what Wrenn 6 and what really made Wrenn 6 kind of explode in popularity is when we got cards like Ragavan that were just 1 toughness creatures that your opponent could play on turn 1. Manadorks, like especially, were very weak. You know, where people wanted to play Birds of Paradise and Noble Hierarch. Like you playing a Noble Hierarch or a Birds of Paradise or a Ragavan on the draw on turn 1 when your opponent was a green-red X deck was very dangerous because of the fact that they would get to play, say, their Ragavan on turn 1, played yours, okay, no big deal. Then they followed up with a Wrenn 6 minus, ping your thing, attack, get in damage, and then be able to, you know, make a treasure, exile your card or whatever with Ragavan or whatever 1-drop they had, and like continue to kind of put pressure on you. And you know, the fact that a lot of the time too, like getting that kind of tempo against your opponent where it's like, well, Ragavan's like the best card in the format at the time, and it just dies to Wrenn 6, and of course Orcus Bowmaster. But you know, this ended up being an ability where when it was relevant, or you know, when it came up, it was very good, and just kind of exacerbated the fact that Wrenn 6 was a 2-mana planeswalker that could essentially nullify your opponent's turn 1 and still demanded that they have an answer for the Wrenn 6, because then at that point you're going to end up 3rd land drop, 4th land drop, 5th, so on and so forth. And you know, the longer it stayed on the battlefield, the more likely you were to just kind of draw more spells because you were getting more lands. So they just kind of went hand in hand with each other. And like I said, when they definitely came up, the emblem was definitely a pretty good finisher. You know, you'd see, you know, Jund decks, you know, this is kind of like the reason to play Lightning Bolt in your Wrenn 6 decks, for the fact that, you know, eventually you were going to go through so many cards that, you know, Lightning Bolt was eventually going to get drawn or end up in your hand in some way and then go to your graveyard. And then you're able to, again, you know, pick up lands with other Wrenn 6s, or just even the same Wrenn 6 if you decide to, you know, go past 7 loyalty and be able and just have it stick around on the battlefield. Like, that was a way that you could theoretically end the game without having to attack. Of course, if it's some of the deck list we're going to look at, a lot of people would probably just concede out of boredom because you were just going to absolutely dominate the game. Maybe not necessarily because of Wrenn 6, but just kind of what it facilitated. And that's kind of the main thing to think about, is that Wrenn 6 wasn't necessarily a planeswalker that was like, and we know that throughout most of like the history of planeswalkers and everything, that a lot of them just ended up being like, this was going to be a thing where if you made the emblem for it, you were going to win the stop, or eventually just by plussing and tactically minusing your planeswalker, that you were eventually going to win the game almost single-handedly on the back of the planeswalker. And now in 2024, where all the creatures are amazing and kind of like spells, you know, the spells are great, and some of the planeswalkers are really kind of overcosted even for what abilities they offer, and it just doesn't feel like the abilities are as impactful, or really even seeing a planeswalker as scary as it was, you know, 10-15 years ago. But the sentiment is still the same, that Wrenn 6 is definitely a facilitator and facilitated some very powerful things that we're going to look at. And of course, the thing to keep in mind is, think of like any of the busted lands that we've seen from the history of the format. You know, like, see Urza Saga end up being a card in MH2 that ended up being super popular, that, you know, ended up revitalizing kind of like the Jund archetype, and fetch lands being super good with all the great fetchable lands we have in the format, the cycle lands, the horizon canopy type lands that we have in the format. It's just crazy, you know, how much Wrenn 6 enabled just from some pretty lackluster abilities like on their face, but you know, of course, in the context of some of these old proving to be a very powerful thing. And so we're going to look at some deck lists and kind of show off like what Wrenn 6 was able to kind of enable in its time, kind of in the sun, as probably one of the best modern planes of all time. So the first deck we're going to look at is Jund. I remember very vividly a friend of mine who absolutely loves just playing Jund. Really, when Wrenn 6 kind of came out, like, this was the card that he's like, this is single-handedly going to bring back the Jund. And he was kind of right, because Jund adopted Wrenn 6, and really up until maybe in the recent time, maybe even now, have to look at some other deck lists, but really this is where, you know, Wrenn 6 wasn't necessarily its most powerful, but definitely pretty versatile in kind of the things that it got to do while abusing some of the more busted things in available to players in the market. So really, for like the +1 ability, you know, again, we have all of the fetch lands, we have Catacombs, we have Fire, things like that. Beside You was a big one. So Beside You essentially being a land that you could channel, so you could pay 1 in a green and discard it, and then you would destroy a target artifact, enchantment, or non-basic land opponent controls, and then you search the library for a card of the basic land type, put it onto the battlefield. Cost 1 less for each legendary creature you control. I mean, really, if you had a Ragavan, it would end up costing 1 less, which at the time, I believe this was in 2023, so over a year ago, this was like one of the best creatures to be playing, even when we're playing for Orchid Master. But to keep that in mind, you know, like Beside You, you know, people playing like Tron decks, you know, people trying to play Lantern or whatever the case may be, someone just trying to do things that you really can't do or shouldn't be doing in the format anymore. You know, you were just able to loop Beside You with Wrenn 6, which ended up being a pretty powerful thing. Because I mean, eventually you could just run someone out of non-basic lands and just, you know, leave them with only basics. This didn't obviously work very well against like the other players that were also playing Wrenn 6, but I mean, eventually you kind of break. Just really in Jund, like your spells were kind of lackluster. And the big one that we alluded to or just straight up talked about in kind of like the last part of that video, you know, Urza Saga ended up being a staple of like these Jund Saga, or, you know, these Jund decks, really just turning them into Jund Saga decks, which, you know, for Urza Saga, you'd be second chapter, be able to make a construct token for 2 and tapping the Saga itself, and you ended up getting to play some like utility artifacts in your deck, because with third chapter you're able to then make a construct, and then you end up sacrificing it after resolving its ability to put a 0 or 1 cost artifact on shuffling your library. And so with Wrenn 6 you're able to pick it up and then slowly over time just make a huge battlefield full of constructs that were just going to pump themselves up. You're able to kind of get an artifact by the end of it, and, you know, have a board full of like 6/6s, 7/7s, 8/8s that your opponent really wasn't going to be able to deal with in a very efficient manner. Now, of course, there are some pretty broken things going on in the format. We see Team of Rhinos. This is when people were still able to play, you know, Violent Outburst. You're able to do on your opponent's turn, Timeless Amulet, 4-color control, which we'll actually get to in a minute, because it turns out that is another deck doing something completely different from what the Jund decks. But, you know, with this, you're able to go get stuff like Shadow Sphere, Pyrite Spellbomb. You're able to deal damage and able to draw a card, Nihil Spellbomb, exile an opponent's graveyard, things like that. Mishra's research desk is a wild one to actually have, just for the fact of, I guess it is pseudo card advantage that you kind of go. Kind of nice to have, but like that's something I've never even seen before in this deck. But that's like the main idea here. Like Wrenn 6 for the most part is pretty fair given everything that is happening in the modern format at the time. Again, you're kind of getting fetch lands. You're able to make sure that you have the right colors of mana that you need to be able to play multiple spells in a turn and continue to hit your land drops, so that you're able to then multi-spell as soon as possible. We see the clean here with a plethora of 1-drops and Orcish Bowmaster being our 2-drops. Be able to push Inquisition, Lightning Bolt, Thoughtseize, and Holy Heat, all, you know, 1-mana cards, 2 Fable. You know, you just have like a decent amount going on here, and then of course looping Saga and being able to loop Beside You and other matchups as well. This was maybe not necessarily the Jund that people remembered, but this was definitely the Jund deck that players gravitated towards too, and ended up being, you know, one of the best, you know, Jund decks that you could possibly play at the time. It's because playing what we would call Boomer Jund really wasn't that good when you had all these kind of busted Modern Horizons cards. And notably, at least at the time, I would have considered like Wrenn 6, Ragavan, and like Urza Sagas to be kind of staples of the format, just given the different decks that were playing these cards, that were playing either one of the 3 or even 2 of the 3. But Jund Saga got to play all of them and was still mid AF, so take that for what you will, Jund players. But now really for the fun one, which is 4-color control. And this is where like Wrenn 6 ended up being I'm not going to necessarily say like broken or anything like that, but this is definitely where it was like, oh my god, we are cooking. So remember, Wrenn 6 can just kind of pick up lands from your graveyard. You know, we have Misty Rainforest and Flooded Strand, Windswept Heath, where we can just use these fetch lands to go and get triomes. And with these triomes, you know, we can essentially, you know, get up to domain pretty easily. We can play Leyline Bindings, whatever the case may be. You know, and this is before we had beans as well, so you know, something to. But the fact that like Wrenn 6, again, just being able to rebuy lands, so just getting back these fetch lands, you had a ton of fetchable lands in your deck to kind of pair with Omnath Locust Creation. You're going to be able to very easily cast this card on turn 4 if you had a Wrenn 6 in play, and you were just going to kind of be able to abuse the landfall abilities on Omnath Locust Creation. Still a very powerful card. Definitely probably another card that would end up in the series, but you know, Omnath definitely got a lot better and was a lot better when Wrenn was good. So this enters the battlefield, draw a card. When a land enters the battlefield under control, you gain 4 life as the first time its ability is resolved. It's the second time you add one of each color except for black, and then the third time it resolves, you deal 4 damage to each opponent and each planeswalker you don't control. While you weren't going to reliably be able to trigger that third ability, you know, or I guess trigger that ability for a third time, the fact that you could play this on turn 4, draw a card, you know, and you know, put on your next turn, hit your land drop, and then add a bunch of mana, you know, see like Bring to Light and some of these other strategies where you would play this and you would go fetch a swamp with like a land, and then you would go and cast Bring to Light for 5 and be able to do some other things. Maybe not necessarily in Modern, but in some like other formats with Omnath. But, you know, again, when you're wanting to trigger this twice, or even against some of the other aggro decks where you just want to play a fetch land to gain 4 life, wait till your opponent's turn, crack it, gain another 4 life, and end up being really good. And the fact that Wrenn 6 just ensured that you're always going to make a land drop, even if you just put a fetch land into play, you know, you could gain 3 life just by plussing Wrenn 6, and eventually get to that point where, you know, your instant sorceries are going to be able to have essentially, well, I guess retrace, so essentially be able to flash them back. Prismatic Ending being very good in the format at the time, Ephemerate to kind of get some more value off of all these cards. Of course, an Elesh Norn here to double up on those, and then even an Aldamari's Call to kind of get, you know, Fury, Endurance, Elesh Norn, things like that. Just some other like really good creatures, and even Solitude. But Wrenn 6 being a big facilitator of this, and of course like the One Ring as well, just being a very broken Magic the Gathering card. But you know, really with Wrenn 6 being able to get you multiple land drops, and in conjunction with Omnath, you're able to offset the cost of the ring, and you're able to draw a bunch of cards. And you know, eventually Wrenn 6 at that point really isn't relevant, but it kind of enabled this crazy 4 or 5 color strategy, which we call Money Pile, which at least according to Card Kingdom now, it's like just under $1,000. But you know, Wrenn 6 used to be like super expensive, and you know, I think it was like a $10-15 card. I don't know what Card Kingdom smoking, but you know, it ended up being a very expensive card. I mean, it was like, I think like $50, $60, $70, $80 at one point. Furies were obviously very expensive at the time. Endurance is also pretty expensive at the time. The One Ring is even more expensive now than really what it was back then, or I guess at a certain point, you know what I mean. But this was kind of, you know, what people were playing, and really probably what you should have been playing. This was one of the best decks that honestly probably just priced a lot of players out. I remember even on my Manatraders subscription, I couldn't even rent this deck. It was that, even though it was that expensive online, and it was also paper where it just wasn't like viable stuff. And of course, a lot of these ended up going up to 80 cards. This was just a 60 card 4 color control version. This was like previously, you know, we would see 80 cards, and Wrenn 6 would essentially be kind of the same thing in that format. I think there's like maybe one other deck that Wrenn 6 is very powerful, and I believe it's the Creativity deck, which we'll jump over to real quick and take a look at, because it kind of plays into a third thing, or you know, kind of again abuses the fact that we probably have some of the greatest lands of all time available to us, not only in Modern but in the Legacy format as well. So here we actually have a Modern version of the Creativity deck. This is kind of what you would see. There was a few different versions of the deck, but really they all kind of played out the same, just maybe one's a little bit more reactive while the other one's proactive. But you would see here, you know, we have Arcana Cruelty, and then recently added a Valgavoth Terror Eater, and you would use a card like Indomitable Creativity or Transmogrify to end up flipping into one of these cards. Wrenn 6 plays a little bit more of like a backseat role, because again, you know, this isn't this card is going to single-handedly end the game. It's going to facilitate a lot. So while, you know, it definitely facilitated like the mana base for some of the 4-5 color control decks and 3-color decks where, you know, you're going to have great mana for the rest of the game the longer stuck around, while Wrenn and 6 also in the Jund versions of the deck really gave you a lot of utility with cards like Passeju and Urza Saga. This deck allowed you to, again, pick up fetch lands. Your mana was going to be absolutely perfect. You're going to be able to cast your triple red spell while also being able to cast, you know, your Fairy Time Ravelers, Paw Patch Formations, and that. Where you also got to abuse some of these lands, like Dwarven Mine, and I believe there was like a 4 or 5 color control had another land like this, Mystic Sanctuary, which was absolutely just absurd. I remember playtesting that deck, and I was just not fair. And Dwarven Mine, probably maybe one of the more fair, maybe the white one's a little bit more fair, but nonetheless, you know, this card enters the battlefield tapped unless you control 3 or more mountains, and when it enters the battlefield untapped, you create a creature token, which is obviously what you need for Transmogrify and Indomitable Creativity. And if you need 3 other mountains in play, conveniently this ends up being your 4th land untapped, and then you can do X1 or play Transmogrify. Essentially, Wrenn and 6 here allowed you to, you know, use your fetch lands to go and get, you know, any of the mountains that you have in your deck, because they're all in different mountains, and then Demir's Garden, being able to tap for multiple colors of mana so you can kind of cast all of these spells. But that was essentially like Wrenn and 6's goal, was to essentially always give you access to a Dwarven Mine at some point, or at the very least to fix your mana to the point where, again, you can cast a Teferi Time Raveler like on turn 3 right on schedule, so that you can cast an Indomitable Creativity or a Transmog, or really like Indomitable Creativity, because having 1 red mana is fine. Triple red in a deck like this that's playing, you know, 3-4 colors, or really even technically 5, is pretty insane to think about, you know. So that is like another part of like Wrenn and 6's game, where it's not only helping you develop your mana and fix it to an absurd degree in all reality, you're also kind of using it as like a combo-ish piece to, again, continue to have access to one of the more important cards of your deck, to then, you know, get to a point where you're gonna do the thing and overwhelm your opponent with an most of them have leaned pretty heavily on the Archon. I can imagine Valgavoth is probably pretty good in Modern. Just ignore this person's 2 and 4. That's kind of where Wrenn and 6 was really cooking a lot of the time, trying to be very powerful, and has gotten less powerful over time, just because, again, dealing 1 damage really isn't all that great. There's some pretty good 1 toughness creatures that you can get with a Wrenn and 6, but in conjunction to like how powerful some of the removal is, you know, stick around on average all that often, so a little unfortunate there. Really quickly, I do want to touch on, you know, one or a few of the deck lists that Wrenn and 6 really saw a lot of play in, and like to kind of get an understanding of the point, because I think you get the gist of why Wrenn and 6 was so powerful, at least in Modern, at least 4 times, where, you know, there's some pretty powerful lands, and even now there's some very powerful lands that Wrenn and 6 just kind of gets to abuse, and, you know, gets to perform some pretty powerful synergies that in like very grindy games just kind of can break a board stall in favor. So this is the November 18th, 2019 article. The Modern Horizons set was released, I believe, like the summer of 2019. When I looked it up, it was like, I mean, we're however many months into the future at this point, and Wrenn and 6 ended up getting banned very shortly after. And the reason is, you know, since their adoption of Wrenn and 6, Temur Delver variants, which you'll find out that like is usually dominated by Delver decks, maybe not as much now, but Delver is kind of like the main reason why we see certain cards get banned. You know, the 1 mana Planeswalker Deathrite Shaman ended up just super powerful, and 4-color, 5-color Delver decks were really good, and it's just kind of like just a hallmark. That's basically like, but they've become dominant in Legacy and Magic Online leagues over the recent weeks. Temur Delver has maintained a 56.5 win rate and earned over 3 times as many 5-0 finishes as the next deck. Most importantly, is a favorable matchup against each of the other 10 most decks. While a strong card in general, Wrenn and 6 is especially powerful in Legacy because of its interactions with Wasteland, which destroy non-basic lands, you know, kind of what we talked about with Seiju, which ended up getting printed later than actually banned in Legacy. just getting to kind of control your opponent's mana, this especially being pretty brutal, considering that you're just able to, again, wasteland your opponent, keep them off of basic lands, and they don't even get anything for you destroying it. You just kind of get to loop it over and over again, while your deck is very efficient in playing just a bunch of 1-drops and getting Force of Will, and that's definitely something to think about when kind of going through this last little bit here. The historic prevalence of metagame defining one type of creatures like Mother of Runes, which we see in Tax's deck, same thing with Dahlia, Guardian of Thraben. You also see Young Pyromancer end up being like a really good in some of the Red Delver decks. Prior to the addition of Wrenn 6 to Temur Delver decks, the Legacy metagame was generally healthy. In order to weaken Temur Delver decks and bring the metagame into a better balance, again, Wrenn 6 is banned in Legacy. And, essentially this is mostly why Wrenn 6 was as dominant as it was, and why it was as good as it was in Legacy and obviously modern metagame, was the fact that, for one, you had a very powerful Planeswalker here that came down super early, very efficient, that could then get some of the most busted lands in Magic, of course being Wastelanded in Legacy, and of course fetch lands on top of that in Legacy, while Modern being able to get fetch lands, perfect mana, and being able to loop Sagas over and over again to make an impressive board, or just getting to loop stage use, blow up your opponent's lands, Horizon Canopy type lands, you're able to loop, draw cards, whatever, on top of getting to deal with just 1 toughness creatures, essentially on curve and ahead of curve of your opponent. Like, imagine like your opponent playing a Thalia on turn 2 after you play a Wrenn 6, and it's like you basically just played your Thalia might have just said remove a loyalty counter from a Wrenn 6 Planeswalker, if you were on the draw. So that's definitely something to remember, and just kind of not to downplay the fact that we don't see Wrenn 6 really that much or at all now in Modern, but to understand that for a while this was a very annoying Planeswalker to deal with, something that players had to actually take into account for when kind of building their decks or when sequencing their turns, because again, like, the amount of tempo that you gain from playing a turn 2 Wrenn 6 when your opponent played a 1-mana card that had only 1 toughness was pretty brutal, and that's kind of why we saw like Delighted Halfling see a lot of play, because it was a 1/2 instead of an X1. So it just like ended up kind of more homogenizing the metagame, and of course that kind of came about also playing Master, instant speed wave, dealing 1 damage to something while also having a Planeswalker that ended up getting a considerable amount of value just by sticking around on the battlefield, and again, not being an integral part of the game plan. So if you got rid of it, it was almost a necessity, but you weren't like getting an opponent's wing off the battlefield. You were kind of delaying what they had going on. If they just had a second one, it's pretty brutal. So let's go ahead and wrap this thing up and figure out exactly why Wrenn 6 is really not that played in Modern anymore. So to wrap everything up, why is Wrenn 6 no longer playable? Why nobody plays it? That's kind of the whole point of the series, right? So Wrenn 6, if you try to play this in Legacy, you are getting DQ'd from the event because it is still banned in Legacy to this day, and probably rightfully so. I think that's probably one of the formats where everything is pretty, I would say, efficient, and Wrenn 6 would still be just a very annoying card to have to deal with, because again, you just have some pretty crazy mana bases, the potential for some crazy mana bases, also getting to play Wasteland, and that's not fun when you just get to play like the 60 best cards in the format with the 15 best cards to combat people doing anything else in the. So I think it's probably a good thing that Wrenn 6 is still banned in Legacy. Modern is the pretty interesting one. Now, it's pretty hard to be a 2-mana planeswalker in, I would say, any format and not see play. You Jace Reawakened, but the fact that Wrenn 6, again, in a format like Modern, where we have kind of the best of both worlds, where we have essentially dual lands that come into play on tap, we have triomes where we can get 3 colors of mana off of, and we of course have the fetch lands, we have surveil lands to get you some card select, we have these channel lands that are very powerful, we have Urza's Saga, which is probably, maybe not necessarily now, one of the better lands. I think that there are other decks that are hyper efficient, like Boros Energy, thanks in part to like the One Ring allowing them to play some very powerful 1 and 2 mana cards and keep dumping their hand almost every turn and offsetting the life cost and everything. But for 2023, for at least the back end of it, or excuse me, 2024, the back end of it, had Nadu format in Boros Energy, and there's just no reason for Wrenn 6 or creativity decks to see any play. I'm sure people are playing Gen Saga 4-color control deck or things like that, but it's just not worth it when the format is hyper efficient or even like hyper combo efficient as it was for like the back half of 2024. And I think even before then, Wrenn 6 was definitely on. I think that, you know, as lands kind of get better, Wrenn 6 is going to continue to get better, but the format has to get to a point where it's not nearly as fast, where we kind of have these games that go just a little bit longer than the first few turns of the game, where essentially so far behind that playing a Wrenn 6 isn't, you know, be kind of laughable at that point. You know, Wrenn 6, even like when you're a little bit behind, can definitely catch you back up, especially now. Again, surveil lands exist to pick up lands that end up getting a cycle for extra cards, whatever the case may be. You know, that's just not something that's good in the format right now. And until we potentially see the banning of the One Ring in weeks from now, as I'm posting this video, then we can kind of get to that point where maybe the format isn't necessarily going, it maybe goes a little bit longer and players aren't, again, drawing 2, 3, 4, 5 cards a turn and getting to kind of loop the One Ring and do things, because that's a kind of long game you don't necessarily want to play. And when you're playing things like Wrenn 6 and you have like insane amounts of card advantage, you know, the card advantage that Wrenn 6 offers you just not what you want in comparison to something like the One Ring, where you just want to pack your deck full of super efficient cards that are going to kind of help you forward your game plan and eventually close out the game. And as we kind of stated, Wrenn 6 is not going to be something that closes out the game, rather a facilitator for what you're trying to do in the format and what your deck is trying to do. And currently the thing that Wrenn offers to those decks just really isn't that good, when again we have just these super hyper efficient decks that are really trying to just, you know, play as many things as possible, get as much value as they can, and then use the One Ring to kind of continually dump our hand on the board and just keep accruing a massive amount of advantage to the point where our opponent really can't overcome it, even with like their own, you know, ring loop drawing multiple cards, because they're not going to be able to offset the life as well as some of these others. And that's why nobody plays Wrenn 6 for really competitive Magic. It's kind of sad because, again, Wrenn 6 was a very popular planeswalker, is a very powerful planeswalker, and unfortunately, as Modern's kind of shifted and we've had multiple Modern Horizons sets come out since the original Modern Horizons, that Wrenn 6 unfortunately is going to be taking a back seat as of right now, possibly until the banning in December. But, you know, let me know what you think in the comments down below. If you think Wrenn 6, what it needs to be to continue to be a playable Magic card, and maybe what it would need to be playable if Boros Energy kind of gets to stick around in kind of its current form, maybe without the One Ring potential. So let me know what you think in the comments down below. Of course, subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed the video, especially if you made it this far, because I do a lot of rambling. So I mean, you gotta like it at some point. Might as well just subscribe so you can get more of that stuff. Check out the links in the description down below. I really do appreciate any and all support. That's gonna be it for me in this video. Hope you all enjoyed it. See you all in the next one.